Once upon a hush of twilight, when the lamps of Edison's age flickered in windows and the wind carried secrets through the slumbering towns, a question hung in the humid air. How far will passion drive a heart before it crosses into darkness? In the quiet streets where prim social manners masked hidden longings, two bodies lay in a grave that would speak of love, betrayal, and judgment for all time. This is the story of the Hall Mills murders, a scandal sewn into the American consciousness, whose echoes still tremble in corridors of betrayal and memory. In the summer of 1922, the little New Jersey town of Sayreville appeared to the untrained eye as an ordinary enclave of churches, modest homes, and genteel society. The railroad tracks hummed in the distance, carrying coal and freight through muddy banks and the warm haze of mid-Atlantic heat. The evening air often held the scent of honeysuckle and freshly mown grass, and behind curtained windows families settled in for quiet nights. Few would imagine that behind this tranquil surface lay a web of illicit passion, ambition, and doomed secrets. Among the pillars of that town stood a gracious Episcopal church, its steeple reaching heavenward, as though pleading for forgiveness before the storm. The Reverend Edward Hall officiated its services with dignity and devotion. He directed the choir, visited congregants in their homes, administered to the poor, and presented an image of upright pastoral rectitude. His wife, Eleanor, was gentle and respected, carrying herself with modest poise. Together, they upheld a public ideal of stability and decorum that many admired without ever questioning whether appearances concealed deeper truths. Not far from their parish home lived a young woman named Frances Stevens, slender and poised, whose beauty and quiet intelligence drew admiration. She assisted in the parish in many ways, singing in the choir, teaching Sunday school, and attending social gatherings. She appeared demure, even pious, yet behind her composed exterior beat a heart that harbored longings and regrets. The gossiping tongues of society whispered about her in subtle tones, wondering why she lingered in the Hall household's orbit so frequently, and why certain eyes seemed to follow her with more than casual interest. Through whispered conversation and furtive glances, a secret relationship bloomed between the Reverend Hall and Frances Stevens, concealed under the pretense of spiritual counsel and social courtesy. In evening shadows and behind closed doors, they exchanged the kindling of intimacy, meeting in secluded parlors or walking paths in moonlight, balancing on a knife's edge between devotion and transgression. They believed themselves discreet, perhaps justified by emotional need, yet the coils of gossip tightened slowly around them, unseen but inevitable. Every town has its undercurrents. Among those currents in Sayreville was the simmering discontent of neighbors, the sharp glances at unusual visits, and the courageous few who noticed hurried goodbyes or late carriages returning. Yet most people glanced away. People preferred to preserve respectability. They believed that in the quiet evenings behind drawn curtains and polite smiles, no harm might seed itself that would uproot their world. Frances Stevens possessed a reserve of dignity that masked her inner torment. She was aware of the precarious nature of her relationship with the Reverend Hall, and she guarded their meetings with cautious secrecy. She did not want scandal, and yet she could not deny the emotional gravity of every whispered conversation, every exchanged letter, every stolen moment. Her own loneliness, whether born of a broken engagement years before or the unfulfilled promise of affection, drew her to Hall in a way that blurred moral boundaries. They corresponded in delicate script, laden with subtext, hidden in envelopes whose addresses showed piety, but whose contents breathed desire. On Sunday afternoons, Frances lingered at the church, offering to play the organ or help with the choir, excuses, perhaps, for extended proximity. The Reverend Hall, burdened by pastoral duties, felt the strain of maintaining appearances even as his affections deepened. He did not wish to wound his wife, and yet in the thick night of his soul, he confessed to her sometimes in private that he felt trapped between duty and longing. In that world of propriety and hidden hearts, rumors began to swirl. Observant parishioners noted that Frances's visits to the rectory grew late, that Hall sometimes walked her home in the dusk, and that the hush of the congregation held knowing silences. The steely grip of gossip tightened its noose. The Reverend's wife Eleanor tried to pretend obliviousness, but in her private moments she wept, wondered, and confronted silence. She observed Frances from behind drawn curtains, questioned her husband in gentle interviews, and strove to preserve the respectability of her household even as it trembled under the weight of undisclosed wrongs. One evening, months before the murders, Frances confided in a friend that she felt shame and fear. She spoke in trembling tones of how she might be trapped in a love that could only lead to ruin. The friend urged caution. Still, Frances responded that love, once kindled, was not easily extinguished by fear or by common sense. In her heart, she believed she might find solace in Hall's companionship, despite the terrible risk. Meanwhile, the Reverend Hall's internal torment grew. He recited sermons before congregations, extolled moral rectitude, and spoke of forgiveness, even as he wrestled with a complicit love. At night, he lay awake listening to the creak of floorboards, imagining Frances's voice and fearing exposure. The contrast between his public facade of certainty and his private disquiet grew sharper each passing day. The moral architecture of his own life trembled on the edge of collapse. On the evening of September 16, 1922, the town of Sayreville settled into its habitual quiet. The air was warm but tinged with the early promise of autumn, and lamps glowed behind lace curtains in 100 homes. The Reverend Hall and his wife offered supper to a visiting parishioner and afterward retired to their mid-level home near the church. Frances Stevens dined at her own lodgings, then left to walk back toward the Hall residence. Some accounts say under the pretense of discussing a musical matter for the choir. In the darkness, the evening's stillness concealed menace. A horse and carriage passed slowly along the road. A sharp noise, a startled cry perhaps, disturbed the quiet. Later, a passerby or neighbor might hear muffled sounds drifting through the night. But in that era, people seldom opened windows or doors at odd hours. Suspicion was never readily entertained. The map of the town's moral compass seldom allowed for violence among known souls. The following morning, garden workers arrived at the church's property, preparing for early maintenance. They strolled past flowering hedges and trimmed shrubs when they discovered something dreadful. The Reverend Hall's body lay in the grass, face down, his hands outstretched. Nearby, beneath a tree, they saw Frances Stevens's lifeless form, half concealed by shrubs, her skirts askew and hair splayed in uneasy disarray. The image of the two together, so intimately clustered, became instantly horrifying and irresistible. They had been shot. Their bodies lay close not by chance but by dreadful design. The news rippled through the town like a poisoned wave. The faithful who had sung in that very church, the neighbors who had exchanged polite greetings, the gossiping ladies at tea, all awoke to a new reality. The darkness they believed safely behind doors was now thrust into the open. The murder of a clergyman and a young woman in one violent stroke redefined piety, dignity, and terror in Sayreville. Authorities arrived, constables, county investigators, local police, surveying the scene, marking bullet shells, examining footprints, furtively lifting fragments of cloth or disturbed foliage. The spectacle of death intruded into parish grounds and private homes. The church itself, a sanctuary, became a crime scene. The steeple stood motionless overhead while beneath, horror and speculation gathered like storm clouds. Villagers gathered at a cautious distance. Some wept openly. Some whispered. Some stood mutely, staring at outlines skirted with police tape or such boundaries as 1920s investigators could muster. The Reverend Hall's wife was told. She fainted. The town reeled under the magnitude of violence visited upon the well-respected religious leader and his companion. The betrayal of safety had arrived in a single dreadful night. In the days that followed, investigators struggled to make sense of what had happened. They interviewed neighbors, questioned alibis, and assembled the threads of rumor as though weaving them into patterns. Among the earliest suspects was the Hall family themselves, including Eleanor Hall, who exhibited calm grief and suggested no motive but cried often of her shock and misfortune. The Halls cooperated, attempted to appear above suspicion, and insisted that no earthly motives could propel such violence. Detectives probed Frances Stevens's acquaintances, her acquaintances in social circles, and her intimate connections. They looked for someone jealous or scorned, someone who might harbor a grudge. The local rumor mill worked overtime, casting suspicion on spurned suitors, disappointed lovers, and those embarrassed by her involvement with the Reverend Hall. Some whispered that Frances had many suitors, that she had rejected several men, and that jealousy brewed beneath polite civility. One suspect who attracted attention was a man named Edward Hall, the Reverend's own brother. He possessed acute intelligence and social standing. Some claimed he had objected to Frances or felt humiliation at the scandal hidden in private. Others speculated he might have desired to protect the Hall name by drastic means. Yet his public persona was calm, his reactions measured, and he denied involvement. Investigators also considered other men, including local residents who had motive in suppressed jealousy or social disgrace. As evidence, the police considered the positioning of the bodies, the trajectories of bullets, small fragments of shell casings, and footprints around the scene. They carefully mapped who lived near, who had walked that evening, and who might have approached furtively. They measured the time it would take someone to walk from Frances's lodging to the Hall property, the possibilities for concealment, the lines of sight, the overhead trees. They sought to reconstruct the intimate path the murderers might have taken. Through this painstaking work, investigators turned up letters between Hall and Frances that bore intimate admissions, but they did not constitute proof of homicide. They unearthed gossip threads, hidden resentments, and social secrets, but none offered conclusive proof. The town's tension deepened as every neighbor wondered whether someone they knew had committed a monstrous act in the darkness. The mansion of reputation became a house of suspicion. The trial ignited a public fervor beyond any local bounds. Newspapers across New Jersey and New York seized the grisly scandal and transformed it into sensational headlines. The press proclaimed clergyman and singer slain, scandal in the pulpit, and murder in the rectory yard. The Washington and New York papers dispatched reporters to Sayreville to track down every whisper and rumor. The townspeople watched as their private tragedy became public theater. Inside the courtroom, witnesses delivered trembling testimony. Some neighbors claimed to have heard voices in the night. Others swore they saw lights moving in windows. The defense attacked the credibility of gossip, pointed out the absence of direct forensic proof, and framed the murder as crime beyond the knowledge of the Hall family. The prosecution pursued indirect inference, emotional motive, and the weight of secret letters. The opposing attorneys traded accusations and objections in a charged atmosphere. The Hall family's reaction became central. Eleanor Hall's grief was front and center, her pale face haunting the courtroom. She sobbed as she was questioned, sometimes refusing to answer. The Reverend's brother, Edward, sat stiffly, answering calmly but without overt emotion. The courtroom audience included clergy, ladies of society, curious onlookers, and sensationalist press. Every glance, every expression became material for speculation. As the trial progressed, the narrative wavered between motive, opportunity, and intrigue. The prosecution urged that jealousy and social propriety motivated a killer within the Hall circle. The defense maintained that any number of outsiders, unknown to the family, could have invaded the parish grounds, that detection was faulty, and that no solid evidence linked any accused individual to the act. The jury listened. The public followed. The social scandal enveloped the system of justice in moral judgment and voyeuristic fascination. In the courtroom's hush, testimonies revealed human weakness. Frances's reputation was assailed. Her past suitors were named, her private letters parsed for hidden meaning. Witnesses insisted she had grown moody, worried about exposure, and perhaps threatened to expose someone if she were scorned. Others denied her supposed statements. The emotional undercurrent surged. Betrayal, shame, fear, and desperate loyalty collided. The trial became not only a legal contest, but a crucible where private desires and communal judgment clashed openly. After days of deliberation, the jury returned. They acquitted the Hall family members of the crime. The brothers, Eleanor, and others named were released from legal threat. Many breathed sighs of relief. Others roared in outrage. Some of the townspeople believed justice had been served. Many believed it had only escaped scrutiny. To some, the acquittal represented a failure of the legal system, a triumph of social status and clever defense over truth. Others contended that without conclusive evidence, no jury could convict. The newspapers split into editorial camps, some railing that the Hall family walked free though stained by suspicion, others applauding restraint and due process. The Hall name remained tarnished. The memory of the murders endured as a stain on local history. In the years that followed, the reputations of all involved shifted subtly. Eleanor Hall moved away from Sayreville. She carried the grief of her husband's violent death and the weight of scandal wherever she went. The Reverend's brother Edward tried to rebuild his life amid whispers. Frances Stevens had already passed. Her body lay silent in memory and rumor, unable to answer questions. Some claimed that her reputation remained misunderstood, that she was neither saint nor villain, but a heart that loved too deeply. The community also shifted. The church still stood. The steeple still pointed upward. Yet each Sunday, as pews filled, the congregants who glanced at the old memorial plaque could not help but wonder what lay behind the quiet piety of their rites. The story of Hall and Stevens became the tale that elders recited with hushed fascination. It became a dark seed in the town's collective memory, a caution about how love, reputation, and secrecy might intertwine to bring ruin. Some amateur investigators long after unearthed new theories. Some dismissed the Hall family entirely, pointing to possible unknown men or hidden enemies. Others insisted that the killer remained there in plain sight, in the very household presumed faultless. In historical journals, true crime forums, and whispered genealogies, the case remained open to speculation. The lover's end in blood had no final owner. By the time the trial ended and the headlines cooled, the public appetite had not abated. The Hall Mills murders had become a benchmark in American scandal, a tragic romance dipped in alchemy of vice, morality, and mystery. Biographers and amateur sleuths combed through court transcripts, personal letters, and local lore. Some insisted they saw hints in stray documents, others in rhetorical patterns of speech. Each reader, each researcher, sought to untangle the knot of motive, opportunity, and secrecy. In later decades, some writers proposed that the evidence had been mishandled, perhaps suppressed. Some believed allies of the Hall family had influenced prosecution paths or evidence access. Others looked beyond the obvious circle, to men in financial conflict, social resentment, or latent jealousy. Historians measured the forensic limitations of the 1920s. Lack of ballistic certainty, primitive crime scene preservation, and blurred chain of custody. In that era, detection was often an art as much as a science, and persuasion often matched evidence in weight. Through those speculative pursuits, human tragedy remained central. Frances Stevens, young and vulnerable, had been drawn into a liaison that taught her the cost of human longing. Hall, a man of faith and visible virtue, had faced private contradictions. Eleanor, his wife, remained a tragic figure caught between public grief and the suspicion of betrayal. Every life carried a shadow. The victims, too, were more than corpses. They had families, memories, regrets, hopes, and fears. The landscape around Sayreville slowly changed. Suburban expansion, changing demographics, and shifting social attitudes made the old names less known. Yet the story persisted in dusty books, archived newspapers, and local folklore. Every time someone picks up the thread, each new reader wonders, did justice falter because the evidence could not connect murder to motive? Or did someone hide behind respectability and walk away unpunished? The story invites readers to peer behind the masks. As decades passed, the Hall Mills murders aged into legend. The church continued its services. The trees in the rectory yard grew taller, their roots quietly pressing on the earth that held the memory of violence. In autumn, the wind might whisper through the branches and stir memory in those who remembered a scandalous love affair that ended in blood. The case endures as a reminder of how love and secrecy can entwine dangerously. It shows how even the most respectable facades can conceal longing, betrayal, and tragedy. It illustrates how the absence of proof need not forestall suspicion, and how community, legal system, and rumor converge in shaping legacy. It teaches that when hearts become laboratories of hidden faith and forbidden affection, danger may emerge under even the gentlest veneer. Sometimes, long after dusk, one might imagine Francis's spirit wandering near the shadows, or Reverend Hall's voice echoing in pews, seeking absolution in a silence no court could deliver. The question remains: who truly pulled the trigger? Who delivered the fatal blow? Was it a jealous brother, an unknown assailant, or fate itself weaving cruel design? No definitive answer commands universal agreement, and the ambiguity persists as the story's haunting core. When you close your eyes after hearing this tale, you might sense the hush of the rectory lawn, the flutter of curtains in moonlight, and the weight of unspoken confessions. You may feel the grief of a wife, the yearning of a lover, and the unresolved ache of a community left to wonder. What do you think truly happened? Share your thoughts in the comments.